The scent of old money, beeswax, and rain-soaked wool clung to the air inside the Gilded Quill. It was a Boston institution, a place where whispered conversations decided the fate of corporations and political careers were made or broken over lobster thermidor. For Clara Miller, it was just Tuesday. A Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. Her apron, starched to a brittle perfection by her own tired hands, felt like a suit of armor. Underneath, she was a bundle of frayed nerves and quiet desperation. The letter from the university's bursar office was tucked into her locker, its words burned into her memory. Account in arrears, immediate payment required to register for the spring semester. Her mother's latest prescription sat unfilled on her nightstand, its cost a small, insurmountable mountain. Clara needed a good night. Not just a good night, a miraculous one. She scanned the dining room, her gaze sweeping over the familiar landscape of dark wood paneling, brass sconces glowing like captured fireflies, and tables draped in linen so white it hurt the eyes. Her section was blessedly quiet for now. In the far corner, nestled in the shadows of a towering bookshelf filled with leather-bound decoys, sat Mr. Silas. He was there 3 nights a week, a fixture as reliable as the grandfather clock in the foyer. He always requested the corner booth, ordered the black tea and the chef's simple broth, and read novels with cracked spines and yellowed pages. He was a whisper in a room of pronouncements, a quiet old man in a frayed tweed jacket who tipped a precise and respectable 15%, never more, never less. "Evening, Mr. Silas," Clara said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the distant clatter from the kitchen. "The usual for you tonight?" He looked up from his book, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to see more than most. They held a weariness that Clara understood. "Clara, good evening. Yes, the usual would be lovely. A storm's brewing outside. I can feel it in my bones." He smiled faintly. "And in here, I suspect." Clara forced a smile back. "We'll batten down the hatches." She was turning to leave when the heavy oak doors swung open, admitting a blast of damp, cold air, and 3 men who moved as if they owned the very molecules of it. They didn't walk, they strode, a phalanx of bespoke suits and blindingly expensive watches. The maitre d', a man named Peterson, who sweated under pressure, scurried toward them like a nervous beetle. Leading the pack was Julian Thorne. He was new money, a tech wunderkind who had made a fortune in an app that did something vaguely important with data and had the social grace of a sledgehammer. His suit was a shade of blue too bright for the august dimness of the Gilded Quill, his hair slicked back with a product that smelled aggressively of sandalwood. Flanking him were Caleb Vance and Marcus Albright, scions of old Boston families, their wealth so ancient and ingrained they wore it with a kind of bored nonchalance. They were there to lend Julian the one thing his billions couldn't buy: legitimacy. "Peterson," Julian boomed, his voice echoing in the hushed space. "The usual table, and I want your best girl on it tonight. No fumbling trainees." Peterson's eyes darted around the room and landed, with a sense of grim inevitability, on Clara. She was his best, efficient, professional, and invisible. The 3 cardinal virtues of service at the Quill. "Miller, table 7 is yours," Peterson hissed as he passed her, his face pale. "Mr. Thorne, very important. Don't upset him." Clara's heart sank. Table 7 was the restaurant's prime real estate, a large circular booth that offered a commanding view of the entire floor. It was also known among the staff as the Bermuda Triangle, a place where tips went to die and souls went to be crushed. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and walked toward them, her notepad a flimsy shield. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Gilded Quill. My name is Clara, and I'll be your server this evening." Julian didn't look at her. He was busy swiping through his phone, his thumb moving with manic energy. "Wine list," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand in her general direction. "And not the regular one. The one you keep in the cellar for people who can actually read it." Caleb Vance chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Easy, Julian. You'll frighten the help." "I want to be impressed," Julian declared to the table at large. "Last time I was here, the sommelier tried to pass off a 98 Lafite as a 96. I could taste the disappointment." Clara retrieved the heavy, leather-bound reserve list. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this was not going to be a miraculous night. It was going to be a trial by fire. As she walked back to the table, her trained eye, the one she was honing for her art history major, caught a detail. Marcus Albright, the quietest of the trio, was wearing a signet ring. It was old, the crest worn almost smooth, but she could just make out the faint outline of a griffin, the Albright family crest. She also noticed the way his eyes followed Julian, not with admiration, but with a kind of weary resignation. She presented the wine list to Julian. He snatched it from her hand. "Right. We'll start with the Montrachet, the Domaine de la Romanée Conti, the 2010. And don't tell me you're out." Clara kept her expression neutral, though her mind was racing. The bottle he'd just ordered cost over $7,000. It was more than a semester of her tuition. "An excellent choice, sir. I'll have our sommelier retrieve it at once." "Don't bother," Julian said, finally looking at her. His eyes were a cold, flat grey. "You get it. I want to see if you can carry it without dropping it. The first test, the first little jab to establish dominance." "Of course, sir," she said, her voice even. She turned and walked toward the cellar, her back straight, feeling their eyes on her. In his corner, Mr. Silas turned a page in his book. But he wasn't reading. He was watching. He saw the subtle stiffening of Clara's shoulders, the forced placidity of her expression. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of young executives in his boardrooms, right before a hostile takeover. It was the look of someone preparing for a battle they knew they couldn't win, but were determined to fight anyway. He took a slow sip of his tea. The storm, it seemed, had arrived. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Julian Thorne held court, his voice a constant, grating presence in the refined atmosphere. He sent back the appetizers, claiming the oysters were insufficiently briny. He complained that the ice in his water glass was melting at an unacceptable velocity. Each complaint was a performance, a public display of his own perceived importance, with Clara as his unwilling stagehand. She moved with a dancer's grace, anticipating needs, clearing plates, refilling glasses, her face a mask of serene professionalism. Inside, a cold knot of anger was tightening in her stomach. She thought of her mother, whose hands, gnarled with arthritis, had worked 2 jobs for 20 years, so Clara could be the first in their family to attend college. She thought of the hours she spent in the university library, the smell of old paper and dust, a comforting perfume. A world away from this casual cruelty. The $7,000 bottle of wine was presented, opened, and poured. Julian swirled it in his glass, held it to the light, and made a great show of sniffing it before taking a sip. "It's adequate," he pronounced, as if delivering a verdict from on high. "A bit tight on the finish. You probably agitated it on your way up from the cellar." Clara simply inclined her head. "My apologies, sir." Marcus Albright, who had been silent for most of the meal, finally spoke. "Julian, for God's sake, it's a perfect bottle. Leave the girl alone." Julian turned to him, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "What's the matter, Marcus? Feeling sorry for the hired help? Don't forget whose coattails you are riding on this new venture. Your family name might open doors, but my money is what's keeping them from slamming shut in your face." Marcus's face flushed a dark red. He looked down at his plate, effectively silenced. The power dynamic was clear. Julian was the sun, and they were merely planets, held in his orbit by the gravity of his wealth. It was during the main course that the incident happened. They had ordered the Chateaubriand for two, carved tableside. As Clara leaned over to serve Caleb Vance, her sleeve brushed against a water glass. It was a near thing, a wobble, but nothing spilled. "Watch it," Julian snapped. "This is a Xenia suit. It costs more than your education." "My apologies, sir," Clara said, her voice tight. As she straightened up, her eyes fell on Julian's wrist. He was wearing a ridiculously oversized gold watch, a monstrosity of diamonds and gears. But it wasn't the watch that caught her attention. It was the cufflink on his shirt. It was a small, intricate thing, supposedly a Fabergé original, a tiny enameled egg. Julian had boasted about it earlier, claiming it was one of a pair gifted to Tsar Nicholas II. Clara's art history training, her obsession with detail, kicked in automatically. She had spent a whole semester studying the work of Fabergé's master craftsman. She saw it in a flash, a microscopic inconsistency. The enamel work around the setting was just a little too perfect, the color a shade too uniform. The authentic pieces always had minute, human imperfections. And the hinge mechanism, it was a modern pressure clasp, not the delicate pin system used in the early 20th century. It was a fake, a brilliant, expensive, and almost flawless fake, but a fake nonetheless. The realization was so sudden and certain that she almost gasped. It was the kind of detail no one would ever notice unless they had spent hundreds of hours studying the genuine article. She filed the information away. An interesting data point in the character study of Julian Thorne, a man who wore a 7-figure watch but a 5-figure forgery. The meal dragged on. By the time they ordered dessert and a round of ludicrously expensive cognac, the bill had climbed to over $12,000. The restaurant was beginning to empty. The low hum of conversation had faded, leaving Table 7's boisterous laughter to echo in the cavernous space. Clara felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a table of difficult customers. This was something else. There was a predatory energy coming from Julian, a sense that the evening was building toward a grand, cruel finale. In his corner, Mr. Silas had finished his book. He closed it gently and placed it on the table. He had been observing the entire spectacle with a kind of detached, anthropological interest. He'd seen men like Julian Thorne before. They were a blight he had spent his life rooting out of his own companies. Men who confused wealth with worth and power with the right to inflict pain. He watched Clara, her movements now slower, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He admired her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of their relentless provocations. He signaled for his check. Marco, the sommelier, brought it over. "Rough table," Marco murmured, nodding toward the center booth. "The boy is a peacock," Mr. Silas said quietly. "All feathers and squawking, but peacocks can be vicious when they feel threatened." "Threatened?" "He owns the room." "He thinks he does," Mr. Silas corrected. "But he's terrified. That's why he has to be so loud." He placed a few bills on the tray, his standard 15%. "Tell Clara to keep her chin up. The night is always darkest just before the dawn." Marco nodded, taking the money. He didn't understand the old man, but he respected his quiet consistency. Finally, the moment came. Julian made a great show of yawning. "Well, boys, I'm bored. Let's head to the aviary for a real drink." He pushed his chair back and stood up. Clara approached the table, the leather billfold in her hand, feeling as heavy as a tombstone. "Will there be anything else, gentlemen?" "Just the damage," Julian said with a theatrical sigh. He didn't reach for his wallet. Clara placed the billfold in the center of the table. A profound silence descended. Caleb and Marcus looked at Julian, waiting for their cue. Julian picked up the billfold. He opened it, glanced at the total, and laughed. It was a short, ugly bark of a laugh. $12,457, he announced. He looked at Clara, his eyes gleaming with a malicious delight. "You know, I've been thinking. The service tonight, it was subpar. The wine was agitated. The oysters were lackluster. My suit was almost ruined. And the general ambiance, your presence, frankly, has been irritating." He closed the billfold with a soft snap. "So, we're not paying." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, I don't understand." "It's simple," Julian said, spreading his hands wide. "We're not paying the bill. We are unsatisfied customers. Consider this a very expensive lesson for the management on how to treat people of my caliber. Now, if you'll excuse us." He started to walk away. Caleb and Marcus, looking deeply uncomfortable but utterly spineless, rose to follow him. "Sir, you can't do that." Clara's voice was stronger than she expected, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and righteous fury. "You ate the food, you drank the wine." Julian stopped and turned around slowly. The playful cruelty in his eyes had been replaced by something hard and dangerous. "What did you just say to me?" "You have to pay your bill," Clara repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Oh, I see," Julian said, walking back toward her. "You think you're in a position to make demands of me?" He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the cognac on his breath. "You're just the help, a nobody. You have no power here." Peterson, the manager, came rushing over, his face slick with sweat. "Is there a problem, Mr. Thorne? Is everything all right?" "No, Peterson, it's not," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, loud enough for the few remaining patrons to hear. "There's a bigger problem, a much bigger one." He patted his pockets theatrically. "My cufflink, my Fabergé cufflink, it's gone." He looked from his empty cuff to Clara, his eyes wide with feigned shock and accusation. "It was there a moment ago, right before she leaned over me to clear the plates." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Clara. "She stole it. The little thief stole my cufflink." The accusation was a physical blow. Clara staggered back, gasping for air. "What? No, I would never. It's worth over $100,000, Julian roared. "She probably thought she could pawn it to pay for her community college classes." Peterson's face went from pale to ashen. A simple walkout was a problem. A theft accusation against his staff by one of the city's richest men was a catastrophe. "Clara, what did you do?" Peterson hissed, turning on her immediately. "I didn't do anything," she cried, her voice shaking. "He's lying. He's trying to get out of paying his bill." "Empty your pockets," Julian commanded. "Go on. Show us you don't have it." Tears of humiliation welled in Clara's eyes. This couldn't be happening. She looked around desperately. The other diners were staring, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Caleb looked at the floor. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. "I will not be searched like a common criminal," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I did nothing wrong." "Then we'll call the police," Julian said with a triumphant smirk. "We'll have them search you, and when they find it, you'll be arrested. You'll be fired. Your life, whatever pathetic little life you have, will be over." He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. Think about your mother, Clara. How will she feel when she gets that call from jail? The mention of her mother shattered her resolve. A sob escaped her lips. She was trapped. It was her word against his. The word of a waitress against the word of a man who could buy the building and everyone in it. Peterson was already reaching for the phone. That won't be necessary. The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. It held an effortless authority that made everyone, even Julian, turn to look. Mr. Silas was standing by his table. He had put on his coat and was holding his old, battered book. He walked forward slowly, his steps measured and deliberate. "Stay out of this, old man," Julian sneered. "This is a private matter." Mr. Silas ignored him. He walked directly to Clara and stood beside her, a frail but unmovable pillar of support. He looked at Peterson. "Put the phone down, Peterson." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Peterson froze, his hand hovering over the receiver. "Sir, this is Mr. Thorne. I know who he is," Mr. Silas said, his pale blue eyes finally settling on Julian. "He is Julian Thorne, CEO of Thorne Analytics, a company that is currently and very quietly being investigated by the SEC for fraudulent investor reports. A company that is leveraged to the hilt with a series of high-risk loans from Boston Merchant Bank." He paused, letting the information sink in. "A bank which, as of 3 months ago, I own." A profound, deathly silence filled the room. Julian Thorne's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed horror. Caleb and Marcus took an involuntary step back, as if a bomb had just been activated in their midst. Who are you?" Julian stammered. Mr. Silas reached into the pocket of his frayed tweed jacket. He didn't pull out a black card or a flashy wallet. He pulled out a simple, worn key ring. On it was a single, heavy, ornate brass key. "I am Sterling Blackwood," he said, his voice no longer the gentle murmur of Mr. Silas, but the resonant baritone of a man accustomed to absolute command. "And this is the master key to every door in this building, because I am the man who built it, 45 years ago." He turned his piercing gaze back to Julian. "You are a guest in my house, and you have behaved abominably. You have insulted my staff, attempted to defraud my business, and worst of all, you have tried to ruin the life of this young woman out of sheer, pathetic spite." Sterling Blackwood's gaze was like a physical weight, pressing down on Julian Thorne, stripping him of his bluster and bravado. The young tech mogul seemed to shrink inside his too bright suit. It was a misunderstanding," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "There is no misunderstanding," Blackwood said, his voice cold as a winter sea. "You created a fiction to avoid a debt, a classic, if unimaginative, maneuver. But you made a critical error. You chose the wrong target." He turned slightly to Clara, who was staring at him, her mind reeling. Mr. Silas, the quiet old man with the tea and the books, was Sterling Blackwood, the reclusive billionaire, the owner of half the city. "You see, Mr. Thorne," Blackwood continued, his attention still on Clara, "you assumed this young woman was merely a waitress. You saw the apron, but you failed to see the person wearing it. You failed to notice her intelligence, her poise, her remarkable eye for detail. It was then that Clara found her voice. The shock and fear receded, replaced by a crystalline, cold clarity. She had been rescued, yes, but she was not a damsel in distress. She had a weapon of her own. "He's lying," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent restaurant. Everyone turned to look at her. "The cufflink wasn't stolen. He never lost it." "And how would you know that, dear?" Blackwood asked gently, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Because it's a fake," Clara stated. Julian's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "The cufflink," Clara repeated, looking directly into Julian's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "The Fabergé cufflink you claim is a priceless antique. It's a forgery. A very good one, but a forgery nonetheless." A murmur went through the few remaining staff and patrons. "That's absurd," Julian blustered, but a flicker of panic was visible in his eyes. "You wouldn't know a Fabergé from a donut." "The enamel work on the original imperial pieces always shows minute imperfections under magnification, a result of the layering and firing process. Yours is unnaturally uniform, a sign of modern vacuum application," Clara said, her voice gaining confidence, sounding like she was delivering a lecture. "Furthermore, the hinge is a modern spring-loaded pressure clasp. The original would have used a far more delicate torpedo-style toggle pin. I noticed it when I was serving your main course." She had him. She knew it. The specific, technical details were irrefutable. She hadn't just called him a liar. She had proven he was a fraud in a way that resonated with his deepest insecurities. Sterling Blackwood was staring at her, his lips parted in a look of genuine astonishment and profound admiration. He had expected to be her rescuer, the lion defending the lamb. He had not expected the lamb to have teeth of her own. "Well, Mr. Thorne," Blackwood said softly, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "It appears you have been caught in a rather embarrassing lie. I imagine your other cufflink, the one you presumably still have, would confirm this young woman's expert analysis. Shall we have my jeweler come down and take a look? Or would you prefer to simply settle your bill and depart with what little dignity you have left?" Julian Thorne stood there, utterly defeated. He had been outmaneuvered, exposed, and humiliated, not just by the billionaire owner, but by the waitress he had tried to destroy. His face was a mottled patchwork of red and white. He looked at Caleb and Marcus, who refused to meet his gaze. He was alone. "The bill," Blackwood said, his voice a quiet command to Peterson, who was standing frozen like a statue. "Bring the bill, and a credit card machine." Peterson scrambled to obey. "As for the tip," Blackwood said, his eyes still fixed on Julian, "given the extreme emotional distress and public humiliation you have inflicted upon my employee, I believe a 100% gratuity is in order. A hazard pay, if you will, for dealing with vermin." Julian choked, but he didn't argue. He snatched the bill from Peterson, slammed his American Express black card onto the tray, and signed the slip with a violent, angry scrawl. He threw the pen down, and without another word, turned and stormed out of the restaurant, his friends trailing behind him like defeated hyenas. The heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving behind a silence that was thick with the aftermath of the storm. The silence in the Gilded Quill was no longer one of awe, but of stunned reverence. The remaining staff moved with a hushed efficiency, clearing the debris of the departed storm. Peterson, the manager, hovered near the edge of the scene, wringing his hands, his face a ghastly shade of pale. He looked at Sterling Blackwood, who had shed the skin of the unassuming Mr. Silas, and now stood as the undisputed king in his own castle. Blackwood ignored him. His entire focus was on Clara. The adrenaline had begun to fade from her system, leaving her feeling shaky and hollowed out. She clutched the edge of a nearby serving station to steady herself. "Are you all right, my dear?" Blackwood asked, his voice softening once more to the gentle tone she knew from Mr. Silas. Clara nodded, unable to speak. She felt a bizarre mix of gratitude, shock, and a strange, fierce pride in herself. She hadn't just been saved. She had participated in her own defense. Blackwood's gaze then shifted, landing on Peterson with the force of a physical impact. The manager flinched. "Peterson!" Blackwood said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Come here." The manager shuffled forward, his head bowed. "Mr. Blackwood, sir. I am so terribly sorry. I had no idea. If I had known who you were, I would have handled things very differently." "That," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is precisely the problem. Your principles are conditional. Your sense of justice is dependent on the net worth of the people involved. You were willing to sacrifice an innocent employee to appease a wealthy bully. You sought a young woman being falsely accused of a crime that would ruin her life, and your first instinct was not to defend her, not to investigate, but to appease her accuser." "I was thinking of the restaurant's reputation, sir," Peterson pleaded, his voice cracking. "You are the restaurant's reputation," Blackwood countered, taking a slow step closer. "And tonight you have tarnished it. The Gilded Quill was built on a foundation of integrity and respect, not just for the patrons, but for the people who polish the silver and mop the floors. You have demonstrated that you understand neither. You are not a leader. You are a coward." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Pack your things. I want you out of my building within the hour. You will be paid what you are owed, but you will not work for me, or any company associated with me, ever again." Peterson looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth to argue, saw the implacable resolve in Blackwood's eyes, and shut it again. Defeated, he turned and walked toward his office, his career at the Quill over. A quiet ripple of approval went through the watching staff. A weight had been lifted. Blackwood turned back to Clara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, with an appraising eye. "Your analysis of that cufflink was remarkable. Unnaturally uniform, a sign of modern vacuum application. Where did a waitress learn such things?" "I'm a student at Boston College," Clara said, finding her voice. "Art history. My focus is on decorative arts of the Russian imperial court." A slow smile spread across Blackwood's face. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his pale blue eyes and warmed them. Of course, it makes perfect sense. The eye doesn't lie. He looked around the opulent dining room. "I have spent a fortune filling this place, and my homes, with beautiful things. But lately, I've begun to wonder how many of them are telling the truth." He grew thoughtful for a moment. "I am an old man, Clara. I've built an empire, but my wife, Eleanor, she was the one with the soul. She was the one who understood art, who understood beauty. Since she passed, the world has seemed a little less vibrant, a little less real." He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to her. He focused on her again. "The gratuity that Mr. Thorne was compelled to leave is, by law and by right, yours. It should be in the neighborhood of $12,000. I trust that will help with your situation." He had clearly overheard her earlier anxieties. Clara's breath hitched. $12,000. It was a lifeline. It was the spring semester. It was her mother's medicine. It was a chance to breathe. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," he said. "You earned it. Not just tonight, but every night I have watched you work. You carry yourself with a grace and dignity that money cannot buy." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim, elegant business card. It was made of heavy cardstock, embossed with a simple, clean crest. "Sterling Blackwood, Chairman, Blackwood Holdings. This is not, however, a long-term solution," he continued, holding the card out to her. "A young woman with your talent and intellect should not be spending her nights carrying trays for fools like Julian Thorne." Clara hesitated before taking the card. "I am in need of a consultant," Blackwood explained. "A private curator of sorts. I have a collection of Russian art at my home on Beacon Hill, much of it acquired by my late wife. I have long suspected some pieces may not be what the auction houses claimed they were. I require an expert eye, a discreet eye, someone who verfishes out the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Quill swung shut, muffling the chaotic symphony of the city and sealing the silence within. The air, once thick with tension, now felt vast and empty, echoing with the ghosts of the evening's drama. For a long moment, Clara stood frozen in the center of the dining room, a solitary figure amidst a sea of white linen. The business card in her hand was a small, dense rectangle of possibility, its embossed letters a tactile promise against her trembling fingers. In her apron pocket, the folded check slip felt less like paper and more like a talisman, a dense, impossibly heavy object radiating both heat and a terrifying lightness. $24,914. It was a number so absurd, so disconnected from her reality, that it felt like a line from a novel, not a fact of her life. The remaining staff moved around her with the hushed reverence of acolytes in a cathedral. They cleared the wreckage of Table 7, their movements careful, as if the space itself were now sacred or cursed. Marco, the sommelier, caught her eye and gave her a slow, respectful nod. It was a gesture she had seen him reserve for visiting dignitaries and titans of industry. Tonight, it was for her. The realization sent a dizzying wave of vertigo through her. She was no longer just Clara Miller, the efficient, invisible waitress. She was a character in the restaurant's new mythology, the girl who had faced down the dragon and walked away with the treasure. But it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice was draining away, leaving a residue of bone-deep exhaustion and a shaky, profound vulnerability. The phantom sensation of Julian Thorne's cognac-laced breath on her face, the venom in his whisper, lingered like a stain. She had been rescued, yes, but not before she had been flayed open, her deepest fears, poverty, helplessness, her mother's suffering, laid bare and used as weapons against her. Sterling Blackwood had been her shield, but she had still felt the blow. Miller. A new manager, a sous chef, hastily promoted in the wake of Peterson's spectacular self-immolation, approached her cautiously. "Mr. Blackwood's man just called. They've processed the payment. It's all yours. You should go home. Take the rest of the week off. Paid." Clara could only nod. She untied the strings of her apron, the starched fabric crackling in the silence. Folding it and placing it on the service counter felt like a final, symbolic act. She was shedding a skin. As she walked through the deserted restaurant, her soft-soled work shoes made no sound on the thick Persian rugs. She passed Mr. Silas's corner booth, now empty, save for a teacup and a saucer. It looked impossibly ordinary. How could a place so mundane have been the stage for the complete demolition and reconstruction of her life? The night air outside was cold and damp, smelling of rain and exhaust. It was a relief after the curated atmosphere of the Quill. She walked, not towards the bus stop, but aimlessly, her feet carrying her through the sleeping, gas-lit streets of Beacon Hill. The check in her pocket felt like a warm, living thing. It was the spring semester. It was her mother's prescriptions for the next 2 years. It was the overdue rent and the utility bills. It was a bulwark against the quiet desperation that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. But as she walked, another feeling began to surface, something more complex than relief. It was a cold knot of anger, not at Thorne, but at the system he represented. The casual, thoughtless cruelty of a world that could allow one man to treat another's life as a plaything. Blackwood had intervened. But what if he hadn't been there? What if he had just been Mr. Silas, a quiet old man with a book? The question echoed in the empty streets. She would have been broken, fired, arrested, her future a smear of shame and suspicion. Her worth, her truth, would have been irrelevant against the sheer, brute force of his wealth. The victory was not that justice had prevailed, but that a king had, on a whim, decided to protect one of his subjects. It was a terrifying, precarious foundation upon which to build a future. She finally stopped in front of a darkened brownstone, grander than the others, its gas lamps casting a soft, golden glow on a polished brass griffin-shaped door knocker. She recognized it from art books, the Blackwood residence. She stood across the street, a ghost in the night, looking up at the silent windows. She was now connected to that house, to the man inside, by a thread of strange, violent circumstance. He had offered her a job, a fellowship, a lifeline, but it felt like being invited from the deck of a sinking ship onto a gilded yacht. The gratitude was immense, but so was the sense of dislocation. Who was she in that world? Could she ever be anything more than the waitress he had saved? The doubt was a bitter taste in her mouth. The next morning, a black town car, silent and sleek as a panther, was waiting for her outside her worn-down apartment building in Alston. The driver, a man with the impassive face of a palace guard, held the door for her. The ride to Beacon Hill was a journey between universes. She left behind the world of cracked pavement, overflowing dumpsters, and the smell of frying onions, and entered a realm of cobblestones, manicured window boxes, and an ancient, unassailable quiet. Mrs. Davenport, a woman who seemed to have been carved from granite and dressed in grey tweed, met her at the door. She led Clara not into a formal receiving room, but directly into the heart of the house, a two-story library that smelled of Moroccan leather, beeswax, and time itself. Sunlight streamed through a Palladian window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden insects. And everywhere there was art, not just on the walls, but integrated into the very fabric of the room. A silver inkwell by Paul de la Mairie sat on a desk. A collection of Roman glass shimmered on a windowsill. It was not a collection. It was a life. Sterling Blackwood was standing by the fireplace, dressed not in a frayed tweed jacket, but in a perfectly tailored cashmere sweater. He was no longer Mr. Silas. He was the man who owned the room, the house, the street. He turned, and the pale blue eyes that had watched her with quiet sympathy now held a keen, analytical intelligence. "Clara, thank you for coming." His voice was different here, without the acoustics of the restaurant to soften it. It held the quiet resonance of command. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "I want to thank you again for last night, and for the tip. It is not a tip, Clara," he interrupted gently. "It is restitution. There is a difference. A tip is a reward for service. Restitution is a payment for damages inflicted. Do not mistake the two." He gestured to a leather armchair near the fire. "Please, sit." She sat, perching on the edge of the cushion. He did not sit himself, but began to pace slowly before the hearth. "Last night," he said, "you demonstrated two qualities I value above all others. The first is courage. The second is a discerning eye. Courage is common enough in the young, but a discerning eye, that is rare. It is the ability to see past the surface, past the story something or someone is trying to tell you, and to perceive the underlying truth." He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. My late wife, Eleanor, had such an eye. She built this collection. She taught me how to see. She used to say that the most expensive things in the world were lies. Not just forgeries in art, but the lies people tell themselves, the lies they build their lives upon. She would have despised Julian Thorne, not for his cruelty, which is merely a symptom, but for his profound inauthenticity. He is a hollow man, a forgery of a person of substance. He paused, his gaze drifting to a portrait above the mantelpiece, a woman with intelligent, laughing eyes and a string of pearls. Eleanor. But she would have been fascinated by you, he continued, his voice softer, because you saw the lie. In the midst of chaos and fear, your training, your passion, your eye, cut through the noise and found the flaw. That is a skill I am in desperate need of. This was it, the offer. But it felt different from how she had remembered it in the haze of the previous night. It was not a gift. It was a proposition. I told you I require a consultant, he said, his tone becoming more businesslike. Let me be more specific. I am the primary benefactor of the Boston Athenaeum's Acquisition Fund. In recent years, several pieces have come to auction with questionable provenance. The art world is awash with brilliant fakes, laundered histories, and clever deceptions. The museums have their experts, of course, but they are academics. They are often too insulated, too trusting. I need someone on the outside, someone with a hungry mind and no preconceived notions. Someone who looks at a masterpiece not with reverence, but with suspicion. He walked over to a climate-controlled vitrine in the corner of the room. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, was a breathtakingly ornate jewelry box. It was covered in gold filigree, lapis lazuli, and miniature enamel portraits. Catherine the Great's dowry box for the Grand Duchess Maria Feodorovna, he said, purchased by Eleanor at Christie's in Geneva, 1998. The provenance traces it back through the hands of Russian nobility and a French industrialist. It is considered one of the finest examples of the period. He looked at Clara. And I believe it is a complete and utter fraud. Clara felt a jolt, a thrill that superseded her nervousness. Why? A feeling, Blackwood admitted. Eleanor felt it too. It's too perfect, too clean. It has the arrogance of a forger, not the soul of an artist. But a feeling is not proof. I want you to prove it. Or prove me wrong. I will give you full access to this library, to my contacts at the university, to any laboratory services you require. I will pay you a monthly stipend of $5,000. Your only job will be to discover the truth of this object. $5,000 a month. The number was staggering. It wasn't just a lifeline. It was a new life. But more than the money, it was the challenge. He wasn't asking her to be a curator of his collection. He was asking her to be its inquisitor. He wasn't offering her charity. He was offering her a weapon and pointing her at a target. The voice in your head, Clara, Blackwood said, his perception unnervingly acute, is telling you that you are out of your depth, that you are a waitress from Alston, not an expert. That is the voice of your past. I am interested in your future. Do you accept the position? She looked from the impossible beauty of the box to the piercing intelligence in his eyes. The fear was still there, a cold whisper in the back of her mind. But for the first time, her curiosity was stronger. Yes, she said, her voice clear and firm. I accept. The following months were an immersion so total that her old life seemed to fade into a dream. The library became her universe. She arrived each morning as the sun was rising over the public garden and often left long after dark, her mind buzzing with ciphers, hallmarks, and the chemical signatures of 18th-century pigments. She learned that Sterling Blackwood was a creature of quiet, unyielding routine. He would join her in the library for exactly 1 hour each afternoon, bringing 2 cups of the same simple black tea he had always ordered at the Quill. He never asked about her progress directly. Instead, he would ask about her process. "What did you learn today, Clara?" he'd ask, and she would tell him about discovering how a master craftsman named Jean-Pierre Adore used a specific 3-part hinge on his snuff boxes, or how the chemical composition of Siberian lapis lazuli differed from its Afghan counterpart. He would listen, his head tilted, asking sharp, insightful questions that often sent her down entirely new avenues of research. In these conversations, the dynamic between them slowly, subtly shifted. She was no longer the girl he had saved, but a colleague, a fellow seeker of truth. He spoke of Eleanor, sharing stories of their travels, of auctions in Paris and dusty antique shops in Rome. Clara began to understand that her work was more than just a job. It was a form of communion. She was helping him continue a conversation with his wife that had been interrupted by death. She focused on the jewelry box with a relentless, obsessive passion. She lived with it, studied its every curve and facet. She read the auction catalogue until she had it memorized. She spent weeks in the university's conservation lab, using X-ray fluorescence to analyze the metal alloys and microscopy to study the tool marks on the screws. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The forger had been a genius. The breakthrough came not from science, but from history. While cross-referencing the list of courtiers in Catherine the Great's court mentioned in the provenance, she found a discrepancy. One of them, a Prince Orloff, was listed as having received the box in 1782. But in a dusty folio of court correspondence she had requested from a Russian archive, she found a letter detailing the prince's fall from grace and exile to his country estate in 1781. He would not have been in St. Petersburg to receive such a gift. It was a small crack in the pristine facade of the story. Energized, she dug deeper. The French industrialist who had owned it in the late 19th century was named Jean-Luc Bisset. The catalogue described him as a passionate collector. But Clara, using Blackwood's access to private financial archives, discovered that Bisset's company had declared bankruptcy in 1895. He wouldn't have been buying imperial treasures, he would have been selling them. The story was a lie. The provenance, the object soul, was a fiction. Armed with this knowledge, she returned to the box itself, looking for the physical evidence of the lie. If it was a late 19th century creation, designed to fool new money collectors like Bisset, it would have been made with the techniques of that era. One afternoon, while examining the miniature portraits under high magnification, she saw it. A fleck of paint, no bigger than a grain of sand, that was a shade of blue, a brilliant, synthetic ultramarine that had not been invented until 1826. It was the final, irrefutable nail in the coffin. She prepared a report, a meticulously researched 100-page document detailing her findings. She laid it on the library desk before Blackwood during their afternoon tea. He read it in silence, his face impassive. He spent a long time looking at the magnified photograph of the tiny blue fleck. When he was finished, he closed the binder and looked not at her, but at the portrait of his wife. "She knew," he said softly. "Her eye was always better than mine." He then turned to Clara, and for the first time she saw not a benefactor or an employer, but a man filled with a profound and quiet pride. The Athenaeum was preparing to bid on a companion piece to this box from the same collection at an upcoming Sotheby's auction. Your report will save them, and me upwards of $20 million. He walked to his desk and took out a checkbook. Your stipend was for the work. This, he said, sliding the check across the polished wood, is for the result. Clara looked down. The number written on the check made her feel light-headed. It was enough to buy a house, to secure her mother's future forever. This is not a one-time project, Clara, he said. This is the beginning. The world is full of beautiful lies. I think we should make it our business to expose them. 2 years later, the Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for Artistic Authenticity was a quiet but formidable force in the art world. With Clara as its director, it funded research, provided authentication services to museums, and discreetly exposed some of the most audacious forgeries of the modern era. Clara had finished her degree, graduating summa cum laude, and was now a respected, if enigmatic, figure in her field. She moved with confidence through a world of auction houses and private galleries, her quiet demeanor belying a reputation for an almost supernatural ability to spot a fake. One autumn afternoon, she was at a prestigious art fair at the Park Avenue Armory in New York. She was there to inspect a potential acquisition for the Getty, a supposed Titian sketch. As she moved through the hushed, elegant crowd, a voice from behind her sent a jolt of ice through her veins. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the scullery." She turned. Julian Thorne stood there, holding a champagne flute. He looked different. Thinner, harder, the boyish arrogance replaced by a brittle, predatory sheen. He was dressed in a suit that was even more expensive than the one he'd worn that night, but it couldn't hide the deep, restless hunger in his eyes. After the collapse of his tech company, he had reinvented himself as a private art dealer, a broker for the ultra-rich who valued discretion above all else. "Thorne," she said, her voice perfectly even. She felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. She was not the terrified waitress anymore. "I hear you're some kind of art world detective now," he sneered, a cruel twist to his lips. "Working for that old fossil Blackwood. I should send him a thank you note. If he hadn't interfered, I never would have discovered my true calling in this far more lucrative world." "A world where provenance is everything?" Clara noted quietly. "Indeed," he said, his eyes gleaming, "and I have a gift for finding things. For instance..." He gestured across the aisle to a brightly lit booth where a small, luminous painting of a girl at a clavichord was displayed on a velvet easel. A previously unknown work by Johannes Vermeer. My personal discovery. It's the talk of the fair. It will sell for over 100 million. It seems my eye is just as good as yours. Clara looked at the painting. It was exquisite. The light, the composition, the mood. It was a masterpiece. But she felt nothing. The same coldness she'd felt from the Russian jewelry box. She walked over to the painting, Thorne following her, enjoying his moment. She leaned in close, her gaze sweeping over the canvas. She saw the delicate craquelure of age, the signature brushwork in the lace collar. It was perfect. And then she saw it. In the shadowed folds of the girl's velvet dress, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a single, tiny, anomalous brushstroke. A stroke made with a pigment that had a faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint. "Bismuth," she murmured, almost to herself. "What was that?" Thorne asked. Clara turned to face him. "The pigment," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet space. "The yellow in the dress. It's Naples yellow as it should be, but there's a trace of bismuth in it. It gives it that slightly greenish undertone in the shadows. It's a beautiful effect." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by her focused intensity. "Of course it is," Thorne said impatiently. "It's Vermeer." "No," Clara said, looking him directly in the eye. "It's not. The process for refining bismuth to the point where it could be used as a stable pigment, what we now call bismuth vanadate, wasn't invented until the early 1920s. It was a favorite of a rather brilliant 20th century forger named Han van Meegeren. I believe he used it in his Christ at Emmaus as well." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Thorne's face went white. The colour drained from it so completely that he looked like a marble statue. He had built his new life, his comeback, on this one painting, and she had just demolished it with a single, quiet observation in front of the most influential collectors and critics in the world. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't called the police. She had simply told the truth. "You," he whispered, his voice choked with a hatred that was terrifying in its impotence. "You taught me a valuable lesson that night, Julian," Clara said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Always check for authenticity. It applies to art." She held his gaze. "And it applies to people." She turned away from him, leaving him to the mercy of the murmuring crowd and the dawning horror of his own ruin. She walked out of the armory and into the crisp autumn air of Manhattan. She felt no joy, no sense of vengeance, only a profound, quiet stillness. She had not been rescued this time. She had not needed a shield. She had stood on her own ground, armed with her own knowledge, and she had won. She took out her phone and called Sterling. "How was the sketch?" he asked, his voice warm through the receiver. "It's real," she said. "But I found something else, a Vermeer." "Did you?" he said, a smile in his voice. "And what did you think of it?" Clara looked up at the towering, authentic skyline of the city, at the real people hurrying along the sidewalks, living their true, complicated lives. "It was beautiful," she said, "but it had no soul." In the silence that followed, she felt the full, unassailable weight of her own life, a life she had built not from privilege or luck, but from the relentless pursuit of the genuine article, and it was more rare and more precious than any masterpiece.